For decades, U.S. sanctions were a tool of power, an invisible weapon meant to control, pressure, and reshape global behavior. Nations that challenged Washington's authority often found themselves cut off from financial systems, trade, or technology. From Iran to Russia, from Cuba to Zimbabwe, sanctions were designed to cripple economies and isolate governments. But in recent years, something unprecedented has begun to unfold. The very weapon once feared across continents has started to lose its power, and nowhere is that more visible than in Africa. Across the continent, a silent transformation is underway. African nations, long caught between the geopolitical ambitions of global powers, are rewriting their economic destiny. One country at a time, they are turning away from dependence on Western systems and forging new partnerships in the East, with China, Russia, India, and even Iran. This is the story of how U.S. sanctions backfired, and how they are giving rise to an entirely new economic order, one that places Africa at its center. It began subtly, through frustration. For years, U.S. policies tied African nations to aid programs, loans, and trade deals that came with strings attached. When some countries refused to align politically, they faced restrictions, suspended funding, or diplomatic isolation. Zimbabwe, for instance, was sanctioned after land reforms and policy disputes with Washington. The result was an economic collapse that affected millions. But decades later, those same sanctions inadvertently ignited something powerful: self-reliance. Unable to access Western credit systems, Zimbabwe turned to China, developing barter trade systems based on gold and minerals. The country began negotiating direct exchange agreements, bypassing the U.S. dollar altogether. It was an early glimpse of a pattern now spreading across the continent. In 2024, the balance of global trade began to shift dramatically. As Western economies struggled under rising inflation and record debt, Africa's resource wealth, from cobalt to oil, from rare earths to agriculture, became more valuable than ever. But when sanctions hit partners like Russia and Iran, they didn't collapse. They simply turned toward Africa. Russia expanded mining and military partnerships in Mali, Niger, and the Central African Republic. China doubled down on infrastructure projects, building ports, fiber networks, and railways stretching across East and Southern Africa. India established new technology parks and manufacturing zones in Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana. And Africa, for the first time, became not just a recipient, but a negotiator. By the time the West noticed, Africa had already begun building its own economic ecosystem, outside of Washington's influence. At the center of this shift stands the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AfCFTA. It is the largest free trade agreement in the world by membership, linking over 1.4 billion people across 54 nations. But what makes AfCFTA transformative is how it integrates with the East. Instead of relying solely on Western markets, African countries are connecting through Eastern-led financial systems, alternative banking networks, digital currencies, and payment platforms that no longer require the dollar as a middleman. When the U.S. sanctioned Russian banks, Moscow responded by integrating with African financial institutions directly. When China faced Western tariffs, it expanded yuan-based trade with African partners. Sanctions, meant to divide, ended up driving new unity. In the words of one African economist, every sanction creates a new opportunity for independence. That independence is now visible in ports, energy corridors, and digital infrastructure across the continent. In Angola, Chinese-built refineries now process local oil, reducing dependence on imported Western fuel. In Ethiopia, India's tech companies are setting up AI and data centers to digitize trade. In Ghana, Russia has become a key partner in the nuclear energy sector. And across the Sahel, nations once dominated by French influence are nationalizing their gold and uranium mines, redirecting profits into local economies. The new Africa isn't waiting for permission anymore. Washington's policymakers are aware of this trend, but they underestimated its speed. For decades, the U.S. dollar's dominance gave it unparalleled leverage. Nearly 80% of global trade was once settled in dollars, allowing Washington to impose restrictions by freezing assets or limiting swift access. But after a series of sanctions against Russia, Iran, and even African partners, trust in the dollar-based system began to erode. African nations realized they needed an alternative, and the East provided it. China introduced the Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, an alternative to SWIFT, allowing international transactions in yuan. Russia expanded the SBFS network, a similar payment framework. Today, African banks in countries like Egypt, Kenya, and South Africa are quietly connecting to these systems, enabling them to conduct trade beyond the reach of U.S. oversight. The result? A multipolar economy, one where Africa can trade freely with both East and West on its own terms. But it's not just financial systems that are changing. The mindset is shifting too. In universities, business hubs, and government ministries across the continent, a new generation of African economists is rising, focused not on dependency, but on sovereignty. They are asking, why should Africa sell raw materials to the West, only to buy back finished goods at 10 times the price? Why should African currencies be pegged to colonial-era systems like the CFA franc? And why should sanctions in distant capitals determine the fate of African industries? These questions are fueling a movement, one that sees technology, innovation, and strategic alliances as tools of liberation. In Kigali, Nairobi, and Accra, digital payment systems are replacing Western-controlled gateways. In Abuja, new policies are being drafted to regulate crypto and blockchain, not to restrict them, but to harness them for local trade. In Johannesburg, the BRICS summit has created a space for Africa to negotiate as an equal, not a subordinate. When the U.S. expanded sanctions on Russia in 2023, few expected Africa to be affected. But as Western investors withdrew, Eastern partners filled the void, quickly, efficiently, and without political lectures. African governments saw the difference. One side demanded reforms before cooperation. The other offered partnership without conditions. And that, in essence, is why the shift eastward became irreversible. The rise of Africa's Eastern partnerships has also redefined geopolitics. In the Sahel region, nations like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger expelled Western forces and sought new defense agreements with Moscow. In East Africa, Ethiopia joined the BRICS alliance, opening access to alternative credit lines. In North Africa, Egypt's Suez Canal is now part of trade routes linked directly to Asia and the Middle East. These moves mark a decisive realignment, one that no longer views Africa as a passive observer, but as a key player in global balance. But beyond the politics and the numbers, there's something deeper at play, a psychological shift. For over a century, the narrative surrounding Africa has been one of aid, dependency, and fragility. Western media often portrayed the continent as a place in need of saving. Yet, the reality unfolding now is far more complex. Africa is not asking for rescue. It's asking for respect. From Ghana's gold-backed currency initiatives to Kenya's innovation-driven startups, the continent is proving that economic resilience is not born from charity, but from control over its resources, its trade, and its technology. Ironically, U.S. sanctions, once meant to isolate African nations, have pushed them to unify. The push for Pan-African economic cooperation has accelerated faster in the past 5 years than in the past 50. As a result, regional blocs like the East African Community and ECOWAS are negotiating directly with Asian economies, bypassing traditional Western intermediaries. In ports like Mombasa, Chinese cranes lift containers filled with African lithium, bound for Asia's electric vehicle factories. In return, Africa receives high-speed trains, AI labs, and energy grids. It's not exploitation, it's exchange. Of course, this transformation is not without risk. Critics warn that dependency on the East could replace dependency on the West, a cycle that must be avoided. Yet, many African leaders insist the difference lies in control. Unlike colonial-era models, these partnerships are increasingly built on joint ownership and technology transfer. Rwanda's AI initiatives, Kenya's fintech innovations, and South Africa's digital mining networks all show signs of local empowerment, not foreign dominance. Today, the world stands at an inflection point. Western economies, burdened by debt and inflation, are struggling to maintain global dominance. Meanwhile, Africa, long dismissed as the next frontier, is emerging as a foundation of the new world economy. Its resources power global industries. Its population fuels the workforce of tomorrow. and its leaders are redefining diplomacy in real time. When sanctions tried to weaken it, Africa found strength. When doors closed, it built its own. Across the globe, a quiet realization is spreading. The future of global trade, energy, and innovation may no longer be dictated from Washington, London, or Paris, but from Addis Ababa, Lagos, and Nairobi. Africa is no longer waiting for permission to lead. It is already doing so, with the East as its strategic partner and independence as its guiding principle. And as America's sanctions continue to ripple across the globe, the question remains not whether Africa will survive them, but how far it will rise because of them.